Good morning, everyone. We don't yet have a quorum, but in the interest of time and in honoring the people who are here on time, I want to get us started. So we will officially convene the meeting when we do have a quorum. And there will probably be some questions as to our agenda and all that for tomorrow, although I have talked to Chair Carlson about it. Why don't I go ahead and take those questions and talk about that when we've got more people here, so we're not just repeating ourselves. With that, I want to welcome back to the committee Commissioner Franz and Budget Director Kelly. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, members. Thank you for having us back again. What I'll do is walk through some slides that give both an overview of the budget, in particular, obviously the supplemental items that were added last week, but we'll try to keep in the context both the overall budget recommendations and those that were added last Tuesday, about a week ago. So if you go through the slide deck here, really things didn't change in terms of the governor's priorities. What changed was the amount of investment that the governor proposed making. He still continues to focus primarily on students 0 to 18 and in schools and early education and breakfast for students, as well as universal pre-K. Still investing in higher education, again, more so in higher education by freezing the cost of tuition, and also continuing to help families by investing in child care assistance, child protection, and mental health services. But we'll walk through some of the details of that. But I think it's important to remember that the governor's budget priorities really haven't changed. They've simply grown with the investments that we have available. So this new chart shows you now the overall budget recommendation of the governor. And this is not just the supplemental, this is the total for both the January budget proposal and now the supplemental budget proposal. So you can see that we've had some change in the beginning balance. One of the things that's happened is that we've had the deficiency bill was enacted, which took some money out of the balance. And the governor is also making some other changes there. So that reduces the beginning balance by $19 million. The revenues will go down slightly with the governor's recommendations. He's proposing 3 different tax cuts that I'll talk about a little bit later on. And the net effect is a $178 million decrease in revenues based on those taxes. The net of those 3 big taxes plus some smaller ones that we'll mention. The expenditures now are at $1.6 billion, and we'll go through those in detail. And the reserves will stay about the same. What you see here is the $1.351 billion. That is the cash account, the reserve account, plus some money in the stadium reserve account. So the budget balance we have now is $1.867 billion, and after the governor's budget proposals, there's $12 million that's left on the bottom line. Now, if you look at the budget, the next slide, you'll see the governor's budget proposal. Once again, this is overall. This is the combination of the January budget and now the supplemental budget. So the governor's priority allocations continue to be E-12 education, $695 million overall. About 37% of the investments are recommended to come in the E-12 education. Higher education now is at $288 million, or 16%. Those two together show there's 53% that the governor is recommending be invested in the education. Health and Human Services, we have a $302 million change, or 16%. And the tax cuts, as I mentioned, the 3 childhood tax credit, the child care tax credit, the working family credit, and the K-12 education credit. Though they total $197 million, although there are a few additional revenue sources that net that down to $178 million. So all in all, with the public safety courts and corrections still remaining about the same at 8%, we see the governor's proposed expenditures, including the tax cuts, at $1.855 billion. The next chart shows that budget in a pie chart format. So this is a $42.8 billion general fund allocation based on the governor's recommendations. So you can see that almost 50% is in education, about 30% is in health and human services, and another 8% in property tax and aids. Those areas itself account for almost 90% of the overall budget allocated by the governor in the $42.8 billion general fund budget. The next slide, now we're going to break down a little bit into different areas, and Director Kelly and I will mix up some of these, and she'll present some, and I'll present some, and I'll let her present the education one.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I'm going to start with the investments the governor's making in E-12 education. In this area of the budget is a $17.4 billion investment in total. Combining January and March recommendations, it's a $695 million increase over the forecasted spending. And I'm going to speak to these items here on the page are specifically in his March recommendations, additions he has made to his budget since the February forecast, $323 million of additional investments in his March recommendations. One is making statewide, his pre-K proposal statewide and universal. And so this will be providing pre-K voluntary for 4-year-olds across the state to better prepare them for kindergarten and to put them on a path for 3rd grade reading proficiency. These are 2 key indicators for improving graduation rates. So in total, he has a $342 million investment in pre-K services. His next item is special education, an additional $39 million on the special education formula to help reduce the unfunded costs, or what we call the cross-subsidy between the gen ed formula and special education. The governor is also replacing his success for the future competitive grant program with a new education aid formula for American Indian students for schools with at least 20 American Indian students to strengthen and expand their academic achievement among those students. He's also proposing that the existing cap on state aid for tribal contract schools that was put in place in 1989 and has not been changed since then be eliminated, and that it be set to match the general education formula funding. Also, he's recommending $24 million for tuition assistance and loan forgiveness to increase the supply and diversity of teachers across the state, especially into high-demand areas. And finally, he's doubling his investment in regional centers based compared to his January recommendations. So an additional $6 million, $12 million total.
I'll go ahead and take the next one. If you put the next slide up, Margaret. So the next slide shows in the higher education, it's a $3.2 billion investment on a biannual basis, $288 million increase in total, both the January and the March proposals. The additional investments are listed here. The $195 million additional investment comes from freezing tuition for 2 additional years at the University of Minnesota, which costs an additional $33 million. Now a total of $65 million, and also a tuition freeze for 2 additional years at our state colleges and universities at the Minsky system, which costs $142 million. And finally, an increase in tuition support for students through the state grant program, a $20 million additional investment there. So the additional amount would be $45 million additional into the state grant program for this next biennium.
Next is the Health and Human Services area of the budget. Total budget for Health and Human Services is $13 billion in general fund spending, a $302 million increase over the forecast base. And in his March recommendations, the governor is making an additional $156 million of investments. The first item is recommendations based on initial recommendations from the governor's task force on the protection of children. He's recommending an additional $50 million to increase the Department of Human Services oversight of child protection services and for case management and early intervention services at the county level. He's also recommending a $100 increase to the MFIP cash grant to address the growing number of children who are homeless, improve the economic stability of families, and support efforts to improve academic achievement overall. For nursing homes, he's recommending a one-time payment increase for nursing facilities to be used entirely for wage increases to help nursing homes compete more successfully in the labor market, a $25 million investment. For vulnerable adults, he's recommending $3 million to maintain existing protections for vulnerable adults in healthcare settings. It's the first increase we've seen for the Vulnerable Adults Act in over 20 years. Safe Harbor and Homeless Youth, two separate initiatives, $3 million to maintain existing protections. $4 million at the Departments of Health and Human Services to help sexually exploited youth get the services they need, and $2 million at the Department of Human Services to expand services for homeless youth to meet the needs in greater Minnesota.
And I'll try the next one here. The next one talks about the investment in public safety and the judiciary. The total amount in this area is $2.2 billion in the general fund. This overall recommendations are a $149 million increase. There's a $16 million increase in this supplemental budget. These three items, we have community supervision, which we would add $2 million, and also, which would bring the total additional amount to $8 million in this area for the biennium. The fugitive apprehension unit would get an additional $400,000. And we would also recommend replenishing the disaster contingency account. $11 million would be used to replenish this account at the Department of Public Safety to ensure funding for the state and federally declared disasters and to match FEMA and the Federal Highway Administration as well as the U.S. Department of Agriculture when there are disaster funds available.
And finally, just a few other key investments in the economic development area. Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, $10 million for the Housing and Economic Development Challenge Program, which creates affordable housing for the local workforce to support business expansion, specifically in greater Minnesota. $2 million for rental assistance for highly mobile families with school-aged children to create housing stability that will ultimately contribute to school success. And finally, $60 million of debt service funding to support an $850 million bonding bill.
And we come now to the tax changes. This chart shows you that there are $197 million in tax cuts, as you can see on the top line, if you can read that. I can barely read it from here. But it's a $178 million general fund decreased net. Now, the governor's January recommendations expanded, most of you know, the eligibility for the child and dependent care credit. His March recommendations expand the working family credit and also, by increasing the number of households that are eligible. But the governor also recommended expanding the K-12 expense credit so that more families at higher incomes would be eligible for that credit as well. So the overall gross changes are $197 million. The net decrease is $178 million to the general fund. We want to end with a chart showing the comparison of the three biennia, the current biennium that we're in now, 14-15, the next biennium, and the future one. You can see by the chart that the total revenues for these three biennia go up. In terms of the amount, it begins at $39.4 billion in 14-15 and goes to $46.1 billion in 18 and 19. The change from 14 and 15 to 16 and 17 is 7.3%, and the change from 16-17 to 18 and 19 is 8.9%. If you look at the expenditure side of the ledger, we start off obviously about the same, a little over $39 billion, and that shows you that we have $457 million in the end of this biennium, and the expenditures go to $42.8 billion in the next biennium, and they would grow to $45.7 billion in the out biennium 18-19 based on projections and the law if adopted by the governor's recommendations. The increase from 14 and 15 is 8.8%, and the increase from 16-17 to 18 and 19 is 6.9%. The last page we want to show is obviously where there's a lot more information for those folks who may be watching. The MMB website has revised budget documents available and also fund balance statements for anyone who is interested in accessing those documents and taking a look at those. With that, Mr. Chair, we're happy to take questions and respond to any issues.
Okay. Members, at this point, I'm going to officially call the meeting to order. The clerk will note the roll. There is a quorum. We have the minutes of March 16th before us. Are there any corrections, additions, changes to the minutes? Representative Carlson moves approval of the minutes. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion prevails, the minutes are approved. Before we go to questions to the Commissioner and Budget Director, I just want to, for everyone's benefit, talk a little about our schedule tomorrow. As you know, tomorrow is the day that we will be officially introducing and acting on the budget resolution in the committee. Because of the schedule today with session, with the transportation bill being introduced in the House, what we're going to be doing is I will be talking to Chair Carlson about the budget resolution and what's in it tomorrow morning, shortly before I expect there will be a press conference on it. I will be waiving the 24-hour rule for amendments to the budget resolution tomorrow night. We will be taking up the budget resolution in the committee here at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. And so everyone should have the day tomorrow to prepare amendments to the budget resolution as they see fit. Then we'll come back here tomorrow night to take it up and act on it. With that, any questions on that schedule for tomorrow? All right. Well, with that, do members have any questions for the Commissioner or Budget Director? Well, then I have some. How about that? So, Commissioner, just to want to confirm, the Governor is recommending no additional money to be put into the budget reserve or cash flow account. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, members, yes, the governor is recommending that that $12 million stay on the bottom line, but we will have obviously the automatic reserve provision operates in forecasts, assuming in November, assuming there's a budget balance, but no additional reserve at this time.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Commissioner Franz. On page 11 of your handout, it looks to me like the child and dependent care tax credit's gone from 100 to 103 million. At 103 million, what's the final phase-out income for folks that'd be eligible?
Commissioner Franz.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I believe it starts a little over $100,000 and phases completely out around $120,000. So the phase-out begins a little over 100. I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but a little over $100,000.
Representative Davids.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Franz, I think at 100 million it phased out at 124, so at 103 it should be. We can talk offline about that. Or
Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, Representative, yeah, there was no change in the original proposal that you saw in the tax committee. What did change was it was repriced in terms of the forecast, and there were some changes there. It also had some interaction with some of the other areas of the governor's budget.
thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner.
Representative Carlson.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I am looking at page 10, and the second item you have there is rental assistance for highly mobile students, $2 million. And it's been some time now, but I did have a meeting with, I think it's 3 or 4 superintendents up my way, Robbinsdale, Brooklyn Center, Osseo, and I think maybe even Anoka. And we referred to it as the Brooklyn Boulevard corridor. There's a lot of rental property, and those 4 school districts are in close proximity. And the big issue was student mobility. They're frequently moving within the school year. And so I think you've identified here a very real issue, at least from their perspective and mine, that if we can bring about some stability within those families so that the students can hopefully finish a school year at a single site, I think that'd be a very good thing. But I'm kind of curious what the criteria is for that $2 million and how far do we reach? I can perceive that almost being consumed in the Brooklyn corridor, just simply because of the number of rental units along that corridor. And many of the families are low to moderate income that occupy those facilities.
Commissioner Franz.
Mr. Chair, Representative, well, you're exactly right. It is a real concern. I mean, we all know that for children to learn, young people to learn in school and be moving around a lot from school to school is just a virtually impossible task. And so this really is designed to try to alleviate that problem. And I think Budget Director Kelly may have some more facts about the reach of the program itself. But
Budget Director Kelly.
Mr. Chair, Representative Carlson, actually, I think that's a really good question for the Housing Finance Agency. This continues the program as it was funded 2 years ago. So it's $2 million in the 14-15 biennium, $2 million again in the 16-17 biennium. And I can't speak to how quickly their dollars go out the door or the extent to which there's a waiting list. I can't answer that.
So, Mr.
Representative
Chairman,
Carlson.
if this was adopted, the base you're saying is 2 million from the current biennium, and then you'd be adding 2 million more for a total of 4 for the next biennium, or
Mr.
is
Chair,
Kelly.
is it flat and continuing at 2?
Mr. Chair, Representative Carlson, you're correct on the latter. It's flat and continuing at 2.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner, thank you very much. I am really delighted to see in the governor's supplemental budget an increase to the MFIP cash assistance grant, which, as we all know, has not increased since 1986, which is just astonishing. So I'm really glad to see this. But my question is, on this page number 8, you have that, and you have this 13 billion general fund, and my understanding is that this money would not come out of the general fund. I believe it's part of the TANF block grant. So could you just please clarify that for us?
Commissioner, Director Kelly.
Mr. Chair, Representative, $68 million is the cost of increasing the MFIP grant for a $100 increase in the grant. $47 million of that will come from TANF funds. And so currently, about $47 million of TANF funds are being used for the working family tax credit. We'll shift the working family tax credit 100% onto the general fund and use those TANF resources to pay for most of the cash grant assistance. And so $47 million will be TANF and the balance will be general fund.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, I see that you've got a bonding bill of $850 million recommended this year. And I guess I'm curious, is that what the governor's recommendation is for bonding for the biennium? As you know, usually we have a sort of smaller bonding bill the first year and then a larger bonding bill the second year. This is probably more typical in size to what we'd have the second year. Is this the governor's recommendation for bonding for the biennium, or is it anticipated we'll have another bonding bill next year?
Mr. Chair, to answer your first question, no. The governor will recommend an additional bonding bill next year as well. So this is not for the biennium. This is for this budget. This is for this legislative session, and he will be more likelihood also looking at another one next year. But obviously, we don't know at this time. But this is not for the entire biennium.
And I guess, Commissioner, do you know how much debt service in the 18-19 biennium does an $850 million bonding bill generate? Do you know offhand? I know it's,
Mr. Chair, I don't offhand. Mr. Marks may, it looks like, but I don't have that. Do you have it?
oh, okay. Mr. Marks has a number here. Mr. Marks, if you could give us that number.
Mr. Chair, from the governor's materials, it looks like the cost of this bonding bill in 18-19, this would be the cost of this $850 million increase would be $101.9 million in that biennium.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Marks. And I guess, Mr. Marks, I guess if there was an additional $850 million bonding bill next year, I guess it probably wouldn't be quite as much as $101 million. Is that correct?
Well, Mr. Chair, and perhaps Budget Director Kelly wants to comment on this too, but the forecast would, the forecast assumes bonding bills that are basically reflective of a 10-year average. So the forecast assumes a $200 million bonding bill this year, or 220?
220.
A $220 million bonding bill this year. So the costs of this, the cost relative to forecasts are the difference between 850 and 220. So it's actually the cost of $630 million more of bonding in the governor's recommendations would be $63 million this biennium and $101.9 million next biennium. The forecast also assumes an $800 million bonding bill next year. So if the bonding bill, if on top of $850 this year, there is $800 next year, there'd be no cost relative to the forecast. That's not to say there isn't a cost, but relative to the forecast, there'd be no cost.
Commissioner, what is our bonding capacity right now for GO bonds, assuming we don't change the various criteria that we have in MMB guidelines?
Mr. Chair, that obviously is a dynamic scoring target that changes with the forecast and the number, but we have a report, I think, that we've issued.
Mr.
Director
Chair.
Kelly.
Mr. Chair, I'm not recalling exactly. We issued a debt capacity report with the February forecast, and I want to say it was in the $4 billion range in terms of how much bonding could be authorized and still be within our guideline number 1, which is a 3.25% debt-to-income ratio for bonds that have been issued.
Director Kelly, I guess there are 2 guidelines, though, are there not?
Mr. Chair, you're correct. There's a second guideline, which is for debt that has been authorized and unissued. And that is, I'm not recalling what that guideline is, but that's an even larger capacity than the first.
Let's see, Mr. Marks is handing me some information on some debt capacity here, and I guess maybe I can just ask Mr. Marks if he can tell us guideline 1, talking about a goal of 3.25%. Can you tell us what this says, Mr. Marks, in terms of the estimated maximum additional principal capacity for tax-supported debt?
Mr. Chair, members, under guideline number 1, which is that the goal is that debt would be 3.25% or less of personal income, I believe, it says the report for the February forecast states $688.9 million. This is principal outstanding, so it's not necessarily what's authorized, but what's actually been issued. But it's $688.9 million.
So, Mr. Marks, is that saying that we could only issue an additional $688.9 million of GO bonds underneath that particular guideline?
Mr. Chair, at the point in time this was done, yes, but this is dynamic in that bonds get paid off and that not all the bonds get issued at the time they're authorized.
Director Kelly?
Mr. Chair, what that refers to is, guideline 1 refers to the amount of debt that we have outstanding. So when you authorize a bonding bill, only about 15% of that bonding bill actually gets issued within a year of that bonding bill being authorized. There is another, it's about 15, 55, I'm not recalling the exact ratios, but the entire $850 million would be issued over a 3-year period of time, and then that first year only about 15 or 20% would actually be issued. So what that first guideline refers to is the amount of debt issued or outstanding. So of the $850 million bonding bill, about 15% would actually be issued and be reflected in that first guideline.
Representative Davids, did you have a question? Oh, okay. Representative Driscoski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner and Director Kelly. You know, I'm curious as I look through this, you know, and think about what has been going on a macro scale with our budget. It seems we are seeing a structural surplus in our budget right now, and as we look at the November forecast versus the February one, really a rapid acceleration of the amount of over-collection of the people's money as a result of that structural surplus, and it looks like that is to continue into the next biennium very rapidly as well. So my question is there anything in this budget that the governor is proposing to address the structural surplus by actually taking less of the people's money, much like we would do in our family budgets.
Commissioner Franz.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I think one of the things that we look at and the governor looked at was the amount of tax cuts that he wanted to put into the bill. There's 197 million in tax cuts, and the net number is about 178 million to the general fund. So that's the amount that he allocates. But I think the key component for the governor in deciding on those particular tax cuts was to make sure they were targeted, very specific, and not sort of broad-based. Because one of the things that we're looking at, you raised the point about structural balance going forward. And it's something that we haven't seen for a long time. And I think our concern is making sure that we don't adjust these levers too quickly or too rapidly. And we believe that these current revenues provide opportunities, as well as providing some tax cuts. They also provide opportunities for universal pre-K and tuition freezes. So there are a number of different ways to have the community share in this revenue that's being generated, and some of those the governor proposes through tuition freezes and universal pre-K. So it's a mix of investments and returning the money through those levers, and also through some tax cuts.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so, Commissioner, and it looks like about 11% are dedicated towards tax credits of sort, not necessarily structural tax cuts, in that we're going, I don't see anywhere in here where the proposal is for the government to stop taking as much money. I don't see any proposal to take less of the people's money. In each and every turn in this budget, appears to me that the government continues to stay in the middle of the decisions around the people and the additional over-collected money that's being taken from them. But even if you grant that 11% that's in the proposal in the form of tax credits as a tax cut, which is not what I'm asking for, a structural tax cut, and I don't see that. But even granted that, it appears that the proposal is to give back to Minnesotans in some form about 11% of the over-collected money, and then spending the additional 90% or 89%. Is that how I read that?
Commissioner Franz.
Mr. Chair, Representative, certainly your math is correct, but certainly we would pose that in a much different way. Obviously, that to the extent that we can provide opportunities, obviously one of the things that we do as a society and as a state is we decide to work together to collect taxes as the whole state and cities and counties, and we use those taxes to make roads, bridges, hospitals, whatever. And in this particular case, the governor believes that in sharing these revenues with the citizens of Minnesota in ways such as universal pre-K and all-day K and tuition freezes and investments in families, that those are opportunities that we can enhance the opportunity for all Minnesotans. And so I think our perspective really would be that we're taking this opportunity that we had about 15 years ago, and after in the late 1999 and 2000, we made some structural changes, as you suggest. And it turns out that those structural changes really made it difficult for us to get through the decade of the 2000s without deficits. We really ate into the revenue stream in a very serious way that had dramatic impacts. And so we would not recommend making those kind of changes at this time.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner.
Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner. I'm looking at the Health and Human Services change page, and one of the things that the governor did was to charge people who are on Minnesota Care more premiums to plug the hole in the Healthcare Access Fund of about $65 million. I see that he's bought that back. And it says, I believe it's somewhere on the other sheet. It's creating a sustainable Minnesota Care program. And the Healthcare Access Fund was slated to actually trigger a decrease in the Minnesota sick tax by an accumulated balance, and that decrease was was canceled when that money was taken from the Healthcare Access Fund and used. And it says here you're creating a sustainable Minnesota Care program. Is there anything to replace that funding stream for the Healthcare Access Fund within the budget?
Commissioner Franz?
Mr. Chair, Representative. No, at this time, I think that expires at the end of the provider tax expires at the end of 2019, if I'm correct. There is no provision at this point to replace that. That's something obviously we need to be concerned about and decide what to do with.
Thank you.
I've got a question on higher education for either Commissioner or Director Kelly. I see you have some additional funding going into the state grant program, but my understanding is that the state grant program is actually going to be showing a fairly good-sized surplus due to some projected lower enrollment. Can you talk a little bit more about what exactly is being proposed for the state grant program? Director Kelly?
Mr. Chair, the governor is recommending that the balance in the state grant program be used and an additional, I'm spacing out on the number, 45 million, thank you, Commissioner. And an additional 45 million be invested in the state grant program to match the grant to tuition at the university, to buy down the family contribution, and one other purpose.
So Director Kelly, is he's increasing the amount of grants that would go to an individual student, or has he changed the program so that more students are eligible for grants?
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure the number of additional students that will be eligible, but he is increasing the value of the grant to the students who currently are eligible, and an additional number of students will be eligible, I believe.
All right. Representative Wagenius.
Well, the obvious question then would be, how does this, the grants program relate to the freeze? Because if we don't have a freeze, it seems to me the grants would be maybe even oversubscribed. Can you just comment?
Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, Representative, one of the things that the proposal obviously tries to do is, as the chair mentioned, it would provide an additional 7,500 students would receive grants, and the amount of the grant would also be increased. So we would see the eligible students would see an average grant increase of $352, with some students getting up to an amount of $1,800, in some cases more. So the goal here is that we have seen an erosion of the support for these students of need. And even with the tuition freeze at the university, these needs still exist and still are really making it difficult for some young people of limited means to get to college. So we're trying to fill that gap as best we can, even with the tuition free. So they go together, frankly.
Representative Wagenius.
I think my question was actually the opposite. If we didn't have the freeze, can you project to us what that grant program would need to look like?
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner?
Representative, I don't know if we have that.
Mr. Chair and Representative Wagenius,
Director.
I think that's a question you would need to direct to the Office of Higher Education. The grant program is not currently a forecasted program, so it's an annually appropriated kind of a capped program, and the value of the grant is fluctuates from year to year based on the number of students. I think there's a certain amount of leeway that the commissioner has to make changes with that, but I think to get the best information, you should talk to Commissioner Pogomiller.
Then I guess Commissioner or Budget Director Kelly, my next question is on the tax area, the K-12 expense credit. I understand, I believe what's happening there is that you're raising the threshold of income at which a family phases out. Can you tell me what threshold that's being raised to?
Mr. Chair, members, the K-12 education would invest an additional $11 million, and what it would, we think it would get to 16,800 more families, and the income adjustment is not in front of me as I'm looking down there. I thought it was. Yeah, it was, well, I know we were working at one point on trying to get it to $50,000 to $55,000 income level because it caps out at around 30-some thousand.
37.5 now,
37.5. We
yeah.
wanted to get it to 50 or above, and I can't remember exactly where we got it to, but I'm pretty sure it's above 50 at this point.
All right, thank you. And then Representative Detmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner, under Health and Human Services, I see an item here, health insurance continuation for severely injured employees. And the amounts there, how did they determine the amounts for that?
Budget Director Kelly.
Mr. Chair, Representative, that is continuing health insurance for individuals who are severely injured on the job at the Department of Human Services and the Department of Corrections. And so those estimates were based on actual experience over the last year or two. So that if they stop working, we would continue to cover their health insurance costs.
Representative
Mr.
Detmer.
Chair, and obviously that is not done already for employees.
Mr. Chair, Representative.
Director Kelly.
That's correct.
Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, I see on the spreadsheet, going back to bonding for a moment, that talks about $850 million in bonding and also cash. Is there a figure do you have a figure for cash you want to spend on bonding projects?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative, actually, that's partly why there's a bottom line of $12 million. There's some cash available there. There's not a specific amount set aside at this time for the cash. It would just depend upon the mix of those bonding projects that required some cash and the availability of cash on the bottom line to meet those needs.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner, I'm also looking at the Health and Human Services on the detail sheet here, and I notice you have a line for managed care oversight enhancements, which is an item of great interest to me, and you've got $685 million in this coming biennium, and I'm just wondering what is included in that, if you can. I mean, I understand you probably could get me some more detail offline, but just generally speaking, is that going to be helping to implement some of the recommendations in the legislative auditor's report regarding ad hoc auditing of the data that we get from the HMOs so that we can better track the billions of dollars that we spend on health programs by, we pay them a capitated amount. And for years, legislators have complained that we're not able to properly track and verify that they're spending it where they say they are. Is this going to help us with that?
Director Kelly.
Mr. Chair, Representative, you're correct. This is for auditing with the OLA.
Thank you.
Commissioner, then I'm looking at the, I guess it would be slide number 12, the biennial comparisons, which is, I guess, the second to the last sheet in our packet. So I guess I just want to understand, so we're projecting for 16-17 that revenues would go up 7.3%, but expenditures would go up 8.8%. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, yes, that is correct.
Okay, and then if I look at the February forecast, I guess we had a surplus projected of $1,869,000,000 for 16-17, and then I saw the planning estimate for 18-19 was $5,060,000,000. Does that sound familiar?
Yes. Mr. Chair, yes.
Okay, so of the $5,060,000,000, if we implement the governor's budget, we'd have $379 million left at the end of 18-19 is what this slide 12 is saying. We'd have used the other $4.7 billion for primarily spending, I guess. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, yes, generally, the $5 billion number you mentioned also assumes the 1.87976 number going forward, so that's included in that, but yes, you're right.
Okay. All right. Representative Carlson.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go back for a moment to the bonding question. You indicated that there's kind of a tradition, if you will, of the major bonding bill being the second year of the biennium. And in recent years, going back a decade at least, that's changed significantly. And I didn't remember what exactly the size of those bonding bills were, so I slipped out for a second and got a list of what they were. And I'm trying to remember, I should remember from that newspaper article. What was the year you left, Mr. Chairman?
Oh, I left in 2006, Representative Carlson, but you're right. We have had large bonding bills sometimes in the first year, including, I think, 2005, with the last first year that I was there.
Yeah, the reason I asked that question, I think you were Ways and Means Chair at that particular time when you left. And in '05, the bonding bill under Speaker Svigum, and when you were chair, was 885, almost 886 million. In '06, it was 949 million. Then in '07, there was one that was vetoed, so that would be our leap year, I guess, if you would. There was a smaller special session bonding bill that was passed. But then right away in '08, then we jumped to two bonding bills, 716 million in '08 and another 105 million in the supplemental bill in that same year. 2009 was down a bit. 10 we were back up at 686 million plus 36, almost 37 in the special session, and then more recently under Speaker Zeller's in 11 and 12, we had just shy of 500 million each of those years. So you are correct when you say that there was a history. When I was first elected, that was the case. A very minimal bonding bill the first year and then a major bill the second year. But in recent years, as these numbers show, and I think they'd probably show even that history going back to the 90s, although I'm not positive, that we have had significant bonding bills in many instances, both years of the biennium. And some of the reasons for that have varied depending on the needs as well as shovel-ready and the job climate at the time and one thing and another. But that was the main point I wanted to make, because things have changed in recent years under both Democratic and Republican leadership relative to bonding, and the trend is more each year that there would be a major bonding bill.
I should mention, Representative Carlson.
I hate to be the historian, but that's what you get after you've been here a while.
Oh, and that's fine, although I also remember the 2004 bonding bill, or lack thereof. There was no bonding bill in 2004, and so to some extent, I think that's why we had a large bonding bill in 2005. But you're right, Representative Carlson, underneath both Republicans and Democrats, we have in more recent years had significant bonding bills both years. I'm not sure that's good. When you do it the first year, you have a lot more of a hit, as you well know, to the budget in terms of your spending than if you do it in the second year. But, you know, such is what it is.
Just wanted
Representative Carlson.
to share a little bit of that history, but
Representative Carlson, anytime, and it's institutional knowledge is good.
well, I had to get a cheat sheet to remember what the exact numbers were, but thank you.
Representative Davids.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you covered the point that the 2005 bonding bill was quite robust because we didn't do one in 2004, so that's kind of an anomaly there. But to the Commissioner, the Governor's looking at $800 and some million in bonding projects for this year. I've always been a big fan of a smaller bonding bill or no bonding bill the first year of the biennium, and a more robust one the second year. And the reason for that is, whether it be Chair Hausman or Chair Torkelson or Chair Knobloch or whoever, I think the bonding committee serves a vital role in going out and looking at those projects. So of this 800 million that we're looking at putting together this year, of those items, I guess basically we're looking at items that the committee hasn't even looked at yet. Is that a concern?
Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, Representative, actually, a lot of the items that we're looking at, reviewing and preparing for the governor's review do include those items that have been on the list for some time. And so there are a lot of the state projects, state agency projects at the university or at the Minsky system or at the other state agencies that the committee has reviewed, it's been on the list and hasn't made it before. There are some new ones, though, in addition, so I understand your concern, but we've tried to really focus on those that have been around for a while and have been vetted to some extent.
The Chair of the Bonding Committee, Representative Torkelson.
Well, just to follow up, Mr. Chairman, if I could.
I'm sorry, Representative Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My real concern is, though, is there's a new bonding chair in town, and I think that bonding chair needs a chance to give a robust look at these, or a very close look at these projects, rather than just throwing a bill together today and getting it passed. So I think it's very important that summer after the first year, and Chair Hausman has been excellent on that, as far as getting out and looking at the projects, making an analysis, and seeing where we want to go. And I think it's a little premature to have a major bonding bill in the odd year without Chair Torkelson's committee giving a good review. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner.
Chair Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Carlson, for the history lesson. Appreciate it very much. But Mr. Marks indicated earlier that the assumptions in the budget forecast, the 220 or so for this year, and I forget the number, 800 or so for next year, are based on an historic average. Could Mr. Marks indicate just how those averages are accumulated?
Mr. Marks.
Mr. Chair, Representative Torkelson, it's a 10-year average of bonding bills in the even-numbered year or in the odd-numbered year. There was an adjustment made to that. However, because there was no bonding bill in 2004, the 2005 bill was actually moved back into 2004 to do the averages, because at that time, I think there was a stronger feeling that it was a small bill in the odd-numbered year, a bigger bill in the even-numbered year, and there was an attempt to not distort the averages. So the 220 is the average for the last 10 odd-numbered year bonding bills, but take 2005 out of it when you do that, because that one was moved into the even years to get the averages, or to adjust the averages.
Thank you, Mr. Marks.
Thank you. Representative Linczewski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have a question for Commissioner Franz, but just listening to the bonding discussion, it's kind of interesting because I've been asking the chair of the bonding committee to come to my district and tour some sites for his consideration. But given the press conference today, it appears bonding this year and the majority is going to be a transportation bill. So I'm hoping to have the chair of that committee tour all the transportation bonding requests I've had. So he's not on this committee, but I'll talk to him today about if he'd come to Bloomington and look at our transit and transportation bonding requests. So maybe that's how it's going to work. And I know everybody here knows that if there will be transportation bonding from the House, it'll require 81 votes. So I hope, people will be ready to tour our districts to hear about those projects. But for the commissioner, and this is with taxes and transportation, I'm trying to get up to speed on what happened this morning with the majority's press conference. And my understanding is that, and I know Chair Davids has been very good about making sure all the tax items that the transportation folks are looking at will be in taxes. But Commissioner, I know the governor is not proposing to carve out any taxes out of the general fund, thereby creating future deficits. Can you comment in the governor's supplemental proposal, why did the governor reject looking at dedicating sales tax on auto parts or more lease vehicles or rental vehicles? Some of the items that are being proposed, the different gimmicks that were proposed this morning. Can you comment on the governor's view and on what he might how he might view those tax approaches?
Commissioner Franz.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I think the main concern is that the governor did not want us to take money from education, from families from other investments in higher education, lower education, and compete with the transportation dollars. We all know, obviously, that there's a transportation issue in terms of the infrastructure and the transit investments that we need to make. The governor believes that we should dedicate new sources of revenue for that, specifically for the transportation and transit funding, so that we don't we create these holes in the general fund, as you indicate. To the extent we carve out exceptions, it's something that we've talked about in our former roles. It is a problem when you start carving out the tax base and making exceptions and dedicating these tax sources to particular items. It makes for less flexibility in budgeting, but it also is clearly taking money that could be used for education and healthcare and other items and transferring it to a source where we think that the better proposal is to provide dedicated revenues for those transportation funding issues.
Representative Lentesky.
Well, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that, Commissioner, and to Chair Davids as well. I hope as you go forward, I know that was just a press conference and a proposal. I hope you'll think about that. You know, transportation is really the winner in the game of dedications already. So transportation funding already is dedicated taxes. That's where they get all their money. Health and Human Services and K-12 and higher ed and everybody else love to have the dedicated revenue sources that transportation has between the gas tax and the motor vehicle sales tax and the license tab fees. And so, you know, I think you might want to think long and hard about if you're really going to go down the road to attempt to take money from the general fund by diverting taxes that go to pay for other things. So, thank you.
Well, seeing no further questions, Representative Driscollowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Franz, you suggested in response to Representative Lenczewski's question that those ideas would take money away from education and health and human services and a variety of other areas. I'm looking at slide 4, and what I understand is the governor is planning what I would characterize as a huge increase in spending with our budget surplus. $1.855 billion of increased spending. Now, you and the governor and others might maintain that the item that's labeled tax cuts, which are actually tax credits, would come off of that. You'd still be looking at 1.6 or 1.7 billion dollars in increased spending, and that's, as I understand, on top of the base increase that we have baked into the budget between the current biennium and the next. So for us to suggest that if we're going to spend money on transportation, or actually, for crying out loud, actually cut taxes in this state when we've got this huge budget surplus, for us to characterize those ideas as taking away from education and taking away from health and human services when we're on these high, very steep spending inclines in each of those areas is beyond belief. And I think when Minnesotans see the governor's proposal and the fact that we've got these huge, what is already a huge increase just with the base spending increase between the current biennium and the next, and then we have $2 billion of the people's money that we're projected to overcollect between here in the next 2 years, and then another $3 billion the biennium after that, and we're saying that we can't cut taxes or we can't use that money on transportation because it will take money away from education, health and human services, a variety of other areas. That's simply not true. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, Representative, well, I think one of the things that people do look at the governor's budget, and they not only believe it, they think it's about time that we started investing in all-day kindergarten and universal pre-K. I mean, when you think about the response to all-day kindergarten, for example, I mean, what do we have? Over 99% of 5-year-olds are now going to all-day kindergarten. So over 50-some thousand students. And so these opportunities don't come along very often. And so the governor believes in his budget. He believes it's right for Minnesota. He believes it's right for us going forward. So he does believe that that's exactly where we should invest the money.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. So then I would suggest, Commissioner, that you and the governor and others say that we want to grow our government and we want to spend more, and we want to inflate the size and role of government in people's lives. Say that, because that's what you're doing. To use the money differently by cutting taxes or using it on transportation is not taking money away from education, health and human services, or anything else. Your proposal is to grow government. Say your proposal is to grow government and make it a more central role in people's lives. If you say that, you'll be accurate, and I will agree with the direction. I will agree with the characterization of the direction you're taking.
Representative Khan.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to correct my good friend Representative Drazkowski on the overcollection issue. The overcollection only appears because of the terminal stupidity under both control of both caucuses of counting inflation only on one side and not on the other side. Starting with a background in mathematics before I went into politics, I believe that equations should balance. And if something has to appear on both sides of an equation, it should be there instead of just counting it on one side, which then leads to the kind of statement you make about overcollecting.
Because we have the bubble.
Representative.
And I will, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, Representative Khan.
I will point out there are two bills, I believe, Representative Rosenthal is the chief author, that would correct that miscalculation in statute. And that would be a very useful thing if Ways and Means would like to have better forecasts in the future, for you to hear both of those bills and incorporate them into your bill. One of them. I mean, they do the same thing in different ways.
Well, Representative Khan, I don't want to get into a big discussion of this, but just briefly on this whole inflation issue. First of all, I guess I should mention that there is an inflation number that is in all the forecasts now. But I guess it's my belief that the whole inflation in the forecast issue is much more complicated than is commonly portrayed. And on the revenue side, actually all of our income tax tables for state income tax are indexed to inflation. Yes. And so from that standpoint, we are already adjusting for inflation on our largest source of revenue. And on the expense side, the largest line item we have, medical assistance, does have inflation taken into account. And we also have some items, such as special education, that have automatic inflators in it. And so I guess I say that only to say that it's more complicated than to just say that we don't have inflation in expenses and we do in revenues. It's more complicated than that. Representative Khan.
Mr. Chairman, if that's true, then you're disobeying one part of the statute. So I do believe all I would like to do is I would like to have good arithmetic practices, and I would like to adjust our statute so that we see that.
Well,
and what you're saying is that we don't have to adjust them because it's already there. I'd prefer to have the statutes adjusted to do what you're doing, if that's the right thing.
Well, we will certainly have further debate on that, no doubt, and if people have amendments they wish to bring, I'm sure we will have a chance to consider them at the proper time. Representative Wagenius.
I'm going to pass now, thanks.
Okay. See no further questions, members. I'm going to adjourn. I'm sorry, is there another question? I'm sorry, Representative Liebling, I didn't see you.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, and just to that point, I just wanted to mention, I think you're right, that, obviously medical assistance is a forecasted program. We do build in inflation. Sometimes, perhaps I would argue, too much. But I just want to say that one of the big bills that's moving through Health and Human Services now is Representative Schumacher's bill to revamp the way we fund our nursing facilities, which is very much needed. And as I'm understanding that bill, it sort of does build in inflation for the first time by kind of looking at real costs and then making rates match that. And in fact, that's something that's very much needed because nursing facilities, we went on tour with the committee and heard from them loud and clear that one of the big problems they have is being able to plan. And I think that that's something we see my understanding of our transportation and the way we do that with the dedicated funds, part of that is because we need to be able to plan further out. And indeed, we've seen sometimes not being able to plan costs you additional money and makes it very hard. And anybody with a business knows that you have to, at least to some degree, you have to be thinking ahead. You can't just be kind of at the whim of an up and down budget. It makes things very difficult. So I'm just saying this in context of Representative Khan's comment, and hope that when we do move forward with this very much needed nursing facility readjustment bill, that we will all agree to build that inflation in there, because it really is very much needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, members, just an announcement of the meeting, 7 o'clock tomorrow night in this room to take up the budget resolution. Republican members, being we've got a little bit of time now between now and the normal adjournment time, I'd like to have Republican members meet up in room 454 immediately upon the conclusion of this meeting. And with that, the members, the meeting is adjourned.